I throw that out simply because I found that thought to be a spur, if you will, to creative thinking as to the architecture and engineering of human assistance. But since I don't want to be struck by the virus, I'll delete the word human, of assistance. That a lot of what we do really is a function of technology, it's a function of engineering strategies, it's a function of training, which the NGO community severely lacks. It's a lot of functions of things which go on in society anyway, but if you encapsulate them within the structure of humanitarian systems, it's almost as if you're moving the humanitarian community outside of society. What have you done? So, getting back to the basic point in the slide, our mechanisms, we have to have some kind of fusion of understanding between all the elements that in fact form society, and I don't exclude the political decision makers who certainly in my country have all kinds of illusions as to what assistance really means. We have to somehow incorporate all those elements into operational modalities which enable the resources, because in my mind there's more than enough resources to deal with disaster. Right now, there's nowhere near enough resources to deal with disaster. Arguably, they exist, but we don't know how to thread them together. I'll tear up the rest of my speech.
So we have some time for questions.
I just want to make a quick comment, given the shortness of time for questions, that for those people who are interested in more formalized thinking, that within the context of all this flexibility and complexity that Roy's talking about, we're going to continue this discussion in a special session immediately following this session at 10:15. So if this is your thing and you want to continue the discussion and we don't have enough time for questions, there's an opportunity.
Andreas Meissner, Fraunhofer, Germany. I have one question which is hopefully answered, can be answered rather quickly. I think if I recall correctly, at one point you said that organizations sometimes would not use information they possess for coming up with decisions. Could you elaborate on whether or not this would be meant as deliberately not using information that has been processed as the basis for coming up with a decision, which in some way, would involve, would suggest that information is still used, or would this involve, or would this mean that there's sitting information somewhere, but there's no capacity or no time to actually go through it, and so it would be disregarded for a decision which has to be taken rather soon?
I think you've answered the question in the way you phrased the second part of it, because sometimes we have information that we know if we took it into account would suddenly mean that our resources to do X were impossible, and therefore we'd have to start coming up with whole new systems of operation in order to accomplish an essential mission. The other side of that is, and that leads one inevitably to realize that if you have information that you can't handle, is there anyone else working in your area with whom you can share that information who can handle it?
I want to thank you for quite an insightful talk, but it occurred to me that some of the problems you expressed for the humanitarians in handling a situation can also be used to describe, even in, let's say, more developed countries like the U.S., why there was great preparedness failure for Katrina and other disasters. We face some of the same problems, even though we're a more developed society, when we don't prepare or mitigate what can be expected.
Well, I think that's precisely the point that I feel needs to be gotten across. And I don't want to stray overly much into the abstract, but at some point, to be perfectly honest, I stopped thinking of myself as a, quote, humanitarian and simply as another part of society, because our whole society is integrated in ways that we refuse to acknowledge. And Katrina was an example.
we have time for one more.
Are there ways that technology can support the interaction between the humanitarian layer and the political layer?
That is an excellent question, because going back to my experience in Washington, one of the things that I had the most difficulty with was providing data that was sufficiently convincing to the people, say, in Congress and the staff and their staffs of situations. And part of the problem is that the visual receptivity of PowerPoint, for example, or limiting it to graphs, for example, I never could find something which was really presentable so that people from all walks of life, people from all degrees of education, could look at something and say, wow, what hit Haiti was unbelievable. And it was almost as if you could prepare a YouTube video that could do it, but you weren't going to show a YouTube video, in some congressman's office. So yes, technology can be used. We just haven't found ways to use it to convince people who are really totally outside of the frame of experience that we are asking them to respond to.
Well, since I don't see a question, I'm going to make an observation. My home community is visual analytics, and that was started by this group. They wrote a book, Illuminating the Path. I made a small contribution to that. In the book, Chapter 5 is communicating with the public, with the organization, information systems, the output of information systems. And that's the chapter in which we've made the least progress over the last 6 years of work. I think it's a real challenge, because it does have to bridge some very complex areas of the human and technology. So with that, if there's no last-minute things, I think we should acknowledge our speaker and move to the next session.
Thank you so much. I'm Peter Anderson. A lot of familiar names. I worked with UNDRO in the early days. Do you know Giles Whitcomb? Yes, Giles.
Is this anyone's scarf? Scarf, anyone?
Yeah, so everything has a very familiar ring, and I still, yeah, but I like to use the metaphor of Carido, and I think that's still something that's transcends, as you say, the virus, but there's another counter-virus in some ways, that people are always trying to push back somehow, even personally,
Which is